The first one is by Andrew Wells, who did his PhD right here, across the way with Gray Worcester, and now is a associate professor of applicable physics associate professor of atomic physics in the physics department at Oxford, and recently finished his probationary period. And also more recently, I think just maybe 2 or 3 minutes ago, finished his slides. So.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk about some work that is going to be a lot of review material, and in particular I thought it'd be useful just to dig down and talk about some of the background and introductory material associated with modeling multi-phase properties of sea ice. When I talk about work that I've been involved with, it's going to be in collaboration with a variety of people, including Joe Hitchens' PhD thesis work, and also some of Jamie Parkinson's emerging PhD thesis work. Also work with Rich Katz and David Rhys-Jones at Oxford, Margaret Lindemann at Scripps, Mary Louise Timmermans at Yale, and Dan Martin at Lawrence Berkeley Lab. So this is going to be thinking about the multi-phase and multi-scale properties of sea ice. It's also going to dovetail with a couple of talks coming up. So I'm not going to talk about all of Gray's work. I'm going to leave him a little bit to talk about later on this afternoon. So he'll go into a bit more detail talking about brine rejection and some more details about ice growth. And then it's also going to dovetail a little bit with a talk by David Rhys-Jones on frazil ice dynamics on Friday. So what I'm going to be talking about and thinking about is how to describe sea ice as a multi-phase material. So if you go away and take a thin section of a slice of ice, so this was done by Hayo Icahn and co-authors, you can image, after you've let all of the brine drain away, you can image where the ice crystals are, which are shown in white in this image, and the intermediate, where the intermediate brine would have been. And you see you've got a complex, porous microstructure to this. So you've got a network of ice crystals with liquid brine in between. And we'd like to understand how this would evolve. So this pore space can be quite important, as Martin said a few days ago, for providing a habitat for life and algae living and other organisms living in the pore space in the interior of this sea ice when it gets porous enough. So we're going to be interested in understanding how these porous materials evolve, and I'm going to introduce you to some continuum models for doing so. So before getting there, you might wonder, how do you get this porous microstructure in the first place? So there's 2 primary modes of ice growth that you can have. One I'm referring to here as the growth of so-called congelation ice. So this is basically taken some existing ice cover at the top of the ocean. You continue to freeze onto the existing ice cover. So you might imagine a layer of solid starting to grow downwards. It turns out when you freeze into salty seawater, you tend to get a morphological instability, and you start to pick out a porous microstructure. And if you go away and take ice cores and look at them through cross-polarizing filters, as Jeffries and others did, you can start to pick out some differences between this type of ice structure and what I'm calling down here granular or platelet ice. So this is formed in a rather different way. So it's basically formed by the accumulation of ice crystals that were originally formed deeper in the ocean. And we're going to talk about these 2 different modes in a bit more detail later on, but the basic picture is that you maintain some region of supercooling initially somewhere in the underlying ocean. This will allow ice crystals to nucleate and grow, and as these ice crystals grow, they'll start to precipitate up onto the overlying ice cover. And it can give you this more random or granular ice texture. So you could imagine playing Tetris with ping pong balls. They'll collect up and form an ice layer at the top. So why are we interested in these processes? So one reason is that the porosity contributes to biogeochemical processes. So the pore space within the ice provides a habitat for both chemical reactions and life, and also some of the processes associated with ice growth, from the segregation of the salt and formation of dense salty brine can also help exchange processes and mixing with the underlying ocean between the interior of the ice and what's below, and potentially even what goes up into the overlying atmosphere. So you heard a little bit about this from Martin earlier in the week. Another reason you might be interested with this is a result of the segregation that happens as you freeze salt water. The water goes into the solid ice crystals, and some of the brine gets rejected into the underlying ocean. So when the ice melts somewhere else in the ocean, you start to provide fresh water. And this combination of brine rejection and ice melt can provide buoyancy forcing for the ocean circulation. There's been some recent work that's perhaps suggesting that, given some insight into what kind of role brine rejection and ice melt might play, particularly looking at the southern, the overturning circulation, or the Atlantic overturning circulation in the Southern Ocean. So this is an idealized 2D schematic from Ghent. You've got Antarctica over to the left as you're looking, and you're looking at some structure of how the ocean circulation varies with depth and then moving north away from Antarctica in the Southern Ocean. And in the Southern Ocean, you basically pick up a region of upwelling some distance from the coast, with winds playing a key role in this. You would pick up two different cells of circulation. So very close to the coast, there's some evidence of sinking Antarctic bottom water. And then a little further away, your upwelling generates into a return flow that spreads as part of your large-scale overturning circulation in the Atlantic. So there's some recent work by Abernathy and others that has shown and looked a little bit at the role of what is actually providing the buoyancy forcing. So their paper goes into a little bit more detail, but I just thought I'd highlight the role of seasonal brine rejection and ice melt. So this is a slightly complex plot if you don't spend most of your time listening to oceanographers talk. What we're looking at here is looking over time how your vertical axis is showing you something called the ocean neutral density. So this is basically a classifier of different density masses of water. But you can basically think about the stuff very near the top is contributing to this bottom water, so the deep sinking water that we saw before in our schematic. And as you go further down, you've got relatively lighter water masses near to the surface and near to the equator. So you've either got a gradient in depth, so your density is increasing as you go upwards, or alternatively, if you move from left to right, your density is decreasing and downwards here. What we're looking at is the contribution of brine rejection and ice melt, shown on a scale where brine rejection gives positive water mass transformation and ice melt gives you negative transformation. We're looking at how this contributes to, or what magnitude these fluxes have in driving the water mass transformation that has to happen to change this upwelling water to a different density. And what you see is you get pulses of order 15 to 20 or more spheredrups. So you've got your winter brine rejection and your summer ice melt occurring through a seasonal cycle. This is starting to penetrate in towards this upper overturning cell. And I guess the interesting point is the magnitude of this water mass transformation is comparable to the overall net transformation that has to happen. So this gives you an idea that the brine rejection and ice melt is playing an important role in the changes in density in the Southern Ocean. Okay, so after stepping through a little bit of motivation, what are we going to go on to talk about? So I'm going to have two main topics that I'm going to focus on. The first one is looking at how we can model suspensions of frazil ice. And then the second is going to start to focus on consolidated, porous, mushy sea ice. So we'll start off by thinking about frazil ice dynamics. So typically you would expect to find this in regions where you can maintain a well-mixed turbulent ocean and also generate strong supercooling, so you need strong cooling. Some places you can do this are in polynyas, so openings in the sea ice cover or leads. As I'm sure you heard yesterday from Pat, you can also get this frazil ice formation playing a particular role where you get cooled and fresh ice shelf water propagating from underneath ice shelves. And what you find is that these ice crystals are growing in the interior of the ocean and precipitating out at the top, so you need some sort of mixing in order to keep these crystals suspended for an appreciable amount of time. So this frazil ice formation is associated with there being strong mixing and supercooling in the ocean where the ice is forming. So there was a pioneering piece of work done on modeling frazil ice suspensions, which I think underpins a lot of what is known today. So this was done by Daly in the 1980s. I just thought I'd pick out the cover of his monograph where he went through and set out a theory of this, just because it's got a very nice picture that illustrates some of the features of the systems we're thinking about. So here you've got a suspension of lots of small disc-shaped frazil ice crystals. So scales from tens of microns getting up to centimeters before they start to become a little bit more complicated in their geometry. And they become morphologically unstable. So we're interested in describing a mix of lots of these buoyant ice crystals in the ocean. So how might we go about doing that? So one way you can work through that is you can think about there being a relatively dilute suspension. So we're assuming the crystals make up a relatively small fraction of the overlying volume of the suspension. This is quite useful because it allows you to do some linearization and simplification of certain bits of the thermodynamics. And it also means you can think quite cleanly about a probability distribution at some point in space of a number of crystals per, sorry, I should be careful. This is not a probability distribution because it has units associated with it, but it's basically a number density of crystals and how of different radii. So you can loosely think of this as being similar to a probability distribution, although you're actually looking at the number of crystals per unit volume. So you might imagine that there might be a peak typical radius, but there's going to be some spread of different crystal sizes as they grow and interact. So we can formulate something for this from a master equation, which basically gives you some information about how you would predict how this distribution of crystal sizes evolves. So if you wanted to predict, so in some ways this shares some similarities to the ice thickness distribution PDF, but there's a few differences because you're dealing with crystal growth and rise rather than ice flow interactions on the surface. You can transport and carry ice flows of your suspension of ice crystals around. So these are familiar transport terms. So transport of a scalar would take this particular form. You can also, if you've got either some turbulent diffusivity or a crystal diffusivity, you can also actually diffuse those crystals around. Although sometimes this may be a very relatively weak effect. Another key thing that you have to take account of is growth. So as crystals grow in size in this supercooled water, you have an overall change in the radius. So crystals will move to a larger radius class as they grow, and you can describe that by a divergence now in radial space of this crystal number density with some growth rate. So this growth rate here you typically infer from some kind of modeling, and I'll come back to that in a minute. The other thing that can happen is compared to the fluid velocity of your mixture, there can also be a relative rise rate of the crystals. So crystals, because they're buoyant, will tend to rise compared to the neighboring background fluid. You can characterize this with some rise term. This will depend on details such as the crystal radius, what its Reynolds number is, etc. But you can write down some laws, and there's some experimental data to give you some idea of what this is, although there's a lot of scatter in that. The things that are not quite as well understood in this system are how crystals interact. So when they collide with one another or get very close, have very close approach, how do they interact with one another? Can they fuse together and flocculate to form larger crystals? Or can you have high speed and high momentum collisions that can actually start to fracture and generate new nuclei? And also the nucleation process is something that's not completely understood, particularly in the context of ocean dynamics. So typically, often when this is modeled, this term is either completely neglected or parameterized in a simple way. The nucleation term is often the thing that often makes a big difference to your final results. So you often have to have either some explicit or implicit assumption about nucleation, and we probably don't have fantastic constraints on that at the moment. So those two terms on the right-hand side are things that we don't understand quite so well. We can also write down corresponding energy budgets, and we could do similarly for solidity, momentum, etc. for your suspension. So you'd behave in a similar way in terms of advection and diffusion of heat. And the key difference is that as your crystals grow, they're releasing latent heat in order to start to remove the background supercooling. So as part of, and this can be done, put together by basically summing over the growth of all of these different crystals and accounting for the change in the geometry as they grow and how the mass changes and how much latent heat they release. So the way I've formulated this, I've embedded in this an implicit assumption that the main thing that is changing is the radius of the crystal. So everything can be characterized in terms of that. Okay. So one of the key features of this is compared to the mushy layer dynamics I'm going to talk about later, is this is an implicit system that is implicitly in local disequilibrium. So you need this disequilibrium in order to drive growth of the crystals. Okay, so often this particular framework is not used in its full detail. So you can start to derive and use some closure assumptions. You can start to derive equations in terms of the bulk concentration, which is basically summing the number of crystals times the area of a crystal of radius r. So you can start to pick out information about variables such as ice concentration, number density, etc., by taking moments of this probability distribution. And often equations are written in a simplified form, making some assumptions about moment closures in here. Okay, so I'm just going to touch a little bit on how you might model these crystals' growth. So this is an image of a frazilized crystal taken by McFarlane. So you see they're relatively thin, roughly disc-shaped when they're small enough. And so there's been a bit of a controversy back and forth in the literature about how quickly these ice crystals might grow. So I'm just going to describe some results of some simulations and mathematical analysis done by David Rees-Jones, looking at trying to understand how do these crystals evolve and how do they grow. So he basically put together, accounted for the reason that these crystals are anisotropic in the growth model. So the basic idea is around the edges of the crystal, you have molecularly rough boundaries and you get relatively fast growth controlled by diffusion. And the supply of latent heat and removal of latent heat and salt around the edge of the crystal. Whereas these relatively flat faces, so the top and the bottom of your pennies, will grow relatively slowly as a result of the kinetics. So when you feed this into a model of the heat transfer and the salt transfer, you can predict how the radius would evolve over time for some particular supercooling. And as a result of this model, you can see that there are differences between different commonly used parameterizations of the melt rate, so the freezing rate. And these can actually become quite significant. So if you leave it to run out long enough over time, you could be talking about factors of potentially 10 or 100 faster growth rate than you might have predicted using this other scaling law. So the basic physical picture behind this is if you want to understand how the mass of an ice crystal changes, you can get roughly, you can consider the heat transfer in the details around the very edge of the crystal, or the overall global heat transfer and what's being conducted into these faces. They turn out to give you very similar comparable scalings. So if we think about the heat transfer coming in through the faces that's being controlled by the large-scale diffusion into the crystal on some characteristic scale based on the radius of the crystal r, you end up picking up this particular form in here. If you also think about what's happening around the circumference of this crystal of thickness h, but it's being controlled by details of heat transfer on the characteristic scale of the thickness of the crystal, you would get this scale for the heat flux times the area of the edge of the disk, and because there's a fortunate cancellation, both of these are scaling linearly in R. When you rearrange this in terms of the radial growth rate, you actually interestingly find something that's completely independent of the radius in this approximation. Okay, so there's some correction factors in here that I think David will discuss briefly in his talk a little later in the week. Okay, so what can these frazil ice models and what have they been used for? So they've been used particularly in terms of these integrated equations for concentration and some assumptions about crystal radii. They've been used to predict sea ice accumulation in leads and mixed layer in detailed models that have either mixed layers or some vertical resolution involved. They've also been used to describe sediment accumulation. So if you've got these frazil ice crystals mixing about in a relatively shallow bit of ocean, some of them can hit the bottom of the ocean and start to pick up sediment, which can get entrained into the ice. So Lars Smedrup did some nice work on that. As Danny mentioned a little bit earlier in the week, and also Smedrup and Martin have looked at using parameterizations of grease ice growth based on loosely on frazil ice dynamics. And they've also been applied to marine ice, so accumulation of ice under ice shelves, so where you get this ice pump where ice shelves start to melt, the fresh meltwater rises, and as it rises, it depressurizes and changes the freezing temperature and gives you ice growth under the ice shelf. Okay, so before moving on to talk about mushy layers, I just want to pick out some recent work that David Rees-Jones has been doing. So this is just to illustrate something that we're working on at the moment, which is thinking about how do these crystals start to interact with one another and start to interact with the flow. So this is a very idealized toy problem just to start to try and build some understanding. We're looking at a system where we basically cool from above and you warm from below to generate some background convective mixing. And then we have fully resolved, or just about resolved, finite-sized particles immersed that are seeded in near the bottom of the domain, that are immersed in the domain and start to mix and interact and then rise up towards the surface. So this is a tool we're starting to use to explore some of these detailed crystal interactions. Okay, so I'm going to shift gears now and talk about a slightly different topic, which is thinking about what happens when all of that ice has started to accumulate, and also if you've started to grow congelation ice and you have something on a much larger scale. So you're thinking about ice on centimeters to meter scale thickness, and where you're starting to consolidate together sea ice flows. And we're going to return to this picture of the porous microstructure by way of motivation. So this porous microstructure is something that evolves in space and time. So as you cool down a particle of fluid, you'll start to freeze more of the water into ice crystals, and you'll change the overall ice fraction and hence change the liquid porosity. And that evolution in space and time can have produce some quite interesting features. So what I picked out in this sketch laid on one of Ken's photos here is a schematic of a brine channel. So you have this region of relatively high porosity where fluid can drain efficiently out into the underlying ocean. And there's some suggestion that you get convection cells where you get a circulation from the underlying ocean through the interior of the ice. You can also see this in MRI scans or other imaging methods. So this in here is an MRI scan. Basically what you're seeing is the red and greenish colors are showing you where there's a relatively high fraction of liquid water. So you see some evidence of there being a region of relatively high porosity that's vertically elongated. So this is a so-called brine channel. And we want to try and understand how this porosity evolves. There's also much more significant porosity in the lower part of the ice too. So this has an impact on the ice properties. It can impact the drainage of dense salty brine into the ocean to force the provide buoyancy forcing for the circulation, and it can provide impacts on the biogeochemistry as we looked at the start. So how can we understand how this evolves? So one approach is to think of it in terms of it being a mushy layer and think on a macroscopic level. So rather than worrying about the details, so I should point out this is an analog material that has similar behavior to sea ice. If you cool this suspension, so if you imagine sea ice growing where you've cooled from the top and your ice layer is growing downwards, you develop this reactive porous material. And rather than dealing with all of the messiness of this detailed microstructure, what you're going to do instead is you're going to average over that microstructure and start to look at how the macroscopic properties evolve, and how features such as these brine channels might emerge. So this is an area that's been looked at for many decades. I'm going to review some of the key results before picking out a couple of more recent things that we've looked at in our group. So mathematically, how do we model this continuum system? What you basically do is you average over the details of that microstructure in some representative volume. So you could probably do this formally via homogenization. I don't think it has actually been done for this particular system, although there's been a lot of work done for two-phase, so solid, liquid, two-phase flow in the interior of the Earth, and also details of the momentum equation for Darcy's law in a rigid fixed substrate have also been looked at before. So what you do is you basically average over this microstructure, but you weight things according to their relative fraction of liquid, so this porosity or liquid fraction chi, and then the fraction 1 minus chi of material in between. So a common assumption in here is that the temperature is, so there's a local equilibrium on the scale of the parcels, so the temperature is equal in both the solid and liquid phases in terms of a local thermal equilibrium. But we allow there to be different salinities of these two different phases. So there's typically an extremely low salinity of the ice, and most of the salt is being captured in this leaving liquid veins. So you can phase average your heat equation, so you pick up phase average properties weighted over these two phases. As this liquid fraction changes as you start to solidify, you either have a release as you're solidifying or a loss as you're melting or dissolving of latent heat. You can form a similar budget for salt. So if you think about the phase average salinity, so taking the liquid salinity S weighted by the liquid fraction and the solid fraction times the solid salinity, this changes due to transport, which we assume the flow is occurring only through the liquid part of this domain, and also via diffusion, which you can typically assume is well approximated as only happening in the liquid. In fact, this is actually often a relatively small correction, although sometimes you need to be a bit careful about it. You also have conservation of mass in this particular medium. So if the porosity wasn't changing, you'd have an incompressible flow. If the porosity is changing, but the ice density and the liquid density are approximately equal, you would also have an approximately incompressible flow. But otherwise, you pick up this source term associated with there being a density difference between the ice and the water, and the expansion or the contraction as you change phase. And then the other thing you need to do is to homogenize your momentum equation. And this recovers Darcy's law average. So you basically average your viscous stresses over this porous microstructure, and then rather than having mu del squared u, you pick out mu over pi, where this pi is a permeability function that is often characterized in terms of the underlying porosity. And then this flow is driven by momentum and buoyancy forces, and I'm here making an assumption that it's a relatively low Reynolds number flow in the interior of the pore space based on the pore scale. So you might have noticed that by doing this phase weighting, you picked up this extra variable chi that's unknown, so you need an extra assumption in order to close. And the assumption that's often used is one of local thermodynamic equilibrium. So this is distinct from the frazil ice models that I was talking about before, which are implicitly in disequilibrium. Here you're assuming on the scale of this little cell of interest, the system is able to adjust quite rapidly to local equilibrium. So the gradients in the interior of this pore space are large enough that you can adjust quite rapidly compared to your macroscopic scale. And then this gives you that the temperature, if you're in equilibrium, the temperature has to be constrained to lie at the salinity-dependent freezing point, or this liquidus temperature in here. So this means the temperature and salinity are implicitly coupled. So mathematically, this does something quite interesting, because you now, once you've solved for temperature, you in principle can infer what the salinity is. And then this in here turns into an equation for the liquid fraction chi, or the porosity chi, and tells you how the porosity evolves via a hyperbolic equation. Okay, so you need to complement that by boundary conditions. This is where things start to get a little messy, so I'm not going to bore you with the full details. I just wanted to highlight a couple of different approaches you can take to solving those equations. So one is you basically split it up into separate regions that are completely mushy, and then match that onto an underlying liquid. You then need boundary conditions to match between this interface, which is a free boundary between the mush and the liquid. So you basically, depending on whether you're including diffusion or not, these take slightly different forms, so I haven't bored you with the full details. But you basically conserve heat and salt across the interface. Then to predict how quickly this free boundary evolves, you use a condition of marginal equilibrium. So sometimes this is sufficient to say that you're exactly at the freezing temperature at the bottom of your mushy layer. But sometimes you find that actually it doesn't give you sufficient information. So particularly if you're neglecting salt diffusion in the system. And then you get slightly more complicated versions of this marginal equilibrium that are reviewed by Schultz and Worcester. Okay, so what are the issues with using this approach? So one thing that can be a pain is if this interface doesn't remain nice and planar and stable, you can start to pick out varying geometry, and then it starts to become a lot more complicated solving your PDEs in this domain of variable shape. So if the free boundary becomes complicated, this becomes quite tricky. The other issue that can arise, so this is more of a computational issue in terms of the complexity, is that if you've got this boundary being the region where the liquid fraction is equal to 1, which often happens for freezing settings, you find if you, for example, if normally you'd think about ice growth being modeled by looking at the difference in the temperate heat coming from the mush side and the liquid side, and then using that to supply latent heat in order to melt ice or remove it to grow ice at rate Vn. Because this is phase weighted in here, if this solid fraction or 1 minus chi factor goes to 0 at the interface, you actually lose an explicit prediction of how your interface evolves. And that can cause some numerical issues because you now get an implicit constraint. So there's another approach you can use, and it's often used in computational simulations, so a so-called enthalpy method. So here what you do is you actually, rather than evolving temperature and salinity, you actually evolve the enthalpy, which has specific heat and temperature, and the latent heating contribution. And then you evolve the bulk phase-weighted salinity, and then given these two constraints and the phase diagram, you use that to infer what the liquid fraction and temperature should be. So this helps with some of the details, such as the complex boundary geometries, because the boundary actually emerges in this particular setting. It has some of its own issues, so you need sufficient resolution to accurately capture the boundary. And you also, because you've got a single domain formulation transforming from a porous region to a liquid layer, you also need to start to think about how you're going to describe the underlying porous how that transition of the momentum equation between porous flow, where you'd expect Darcy's law to do okay, and Navier-Stokes equations. So you might, for example, use a Darcy-Brinkman equation. Okay, so I'm just going to finish up by highlighting a couple of bits of recent work. So firstly, looking at some results from Joe Hitchin's PhD thesis, which is being written as I speak, I imagine. So we've been looking at the impact of cooling rates on the initial growth of the sea ice, but also starting to think about how it impacts convection. So if we initially think about diffusive solidification, we're cooling some ocean with some characteristic temperature and salinity that has a freezing temperature associated with it. And your ice is growing downwards. What we've done is we've started to look at what the impact of the cooling rate is. So a lot of the theoretical work on this initially was done with assuming a constant temperature at the top. We've started to allow a boundary condition that's a linearization of a more realistic surface boundary condition that you'd introduce at the top of the ice. So you basically have a mixed boundary condition where the temperature gradient, the heat conducted into the ice, actually depends on what the surface temperature is in this linear form in here. So there's a characteristic efficiency or rate of cooling due to heat loss to the overlying atmosphere that's built into this coefficient in here, which is characterized by a Bio number. And what you find is that will tend to impact this cooling rate can start to impact the structure of the ice. So what I'm plotting here, for a range of different cooling rates, or the way we've scaled this also corresponds to different times in the simulation as the ice grows thicker. We're plotting the liquid fraction and how it varies with a scaled depth, scaled by this diffusion scale in here. And as you vary and increase the efficiency of cooling, what you find is you transition from a mostly porous layer, either at early times or for slow cooling. You can start to develop regions of relatively high solid fraction or low liquid fraction. So low porosity region through much of the depth of the ice, and then there's some transition region in here. And this is actually also another issue that crops up with the enthalpy method. Often there's one grid cell advances can give you slight oscillations in terms of how the ice grows. Okay, so what does this impact? So we said before we're interested in convection in the interior of the ice. How does this impact convection? So what Joe's been working on is looking at a linear stability analysis. So this is actually in one of these split domain formulations, but taking the variation of the porosity with depth given by the purple curve in here, and then that also starts to impact the permeability using a standard cubic correlation to link these two together. So this variation in the liquid fraction with depth starts to give you variations in the permeability. So you see you have this relatively high permeability region low down in the ice, but then it becomes far less permeable at depth. And this is just a result of a smoothly varying nonlinear permeability function. So if you go away and figure out whether this initial base state starts to convect or not, and we've illustrated it here by varying the system parameters for two different cases where there's a relatively slowly varying permeability and a much more rapidly varying permeability down here that might correspond to different regions on that phase space we saw before in the previous diagram. You find there's a significant difference in the structure of the underlying convection cells that are being predicted at linear instability. So when you've got this sharp transition in permeability near the bottom of the mushy layer, you're getting a confinement of your convection to some scale characteristic depth hc. So you can characterize how this depth of convection varies as you vary system parameters and vary this depth of confinement and the depth of the underlying convection, how far it's penetrating through the interior of the mushy layer. And you can go away and find that if this confinement depth is much smaller than the overall depth, you get a threshold. So this is, for those who know, this is commonly characterized in terms of a Rayleigh number. Because of the time, I'm not going to go into details of describing where this comes from, but it actually shows some dependence on the thickness of this confining region. So we're hoping to use this to inform parameterizations of brine rejection. The other thing we can do is so that was obviously looking at a linear stability analysis, so you're looking at small deviations from diffusive growth. As we saw before, this system will then eventually start to generate brine channels. So some work by Jamie Parkinson, some of you may have seen his poster earlier in the week, which is hopefully still there if you've got any questions. You can simulate this using two-dimensional enthalpy methods. So we assume you're in a thin Healy-Shore cell, and you're going to watch as you start to cool from above. Your ice is going to start to grow downwards. You're going to get convection into the underlying liquid. And we're going to look at how the porosity field is evolving over time as the ice grows, given by this color scale in here. So dark colors are relatively low porosity, lots of ice, and the lighter colors are almost liquid. So the white end of the scale gives you liquid, and also how the salinity is varying, as shown by the contours. And you can start to predict how the salinity would vary in time. So it captures something. We haven't gone through and done a systematic comparison yet, but it captures something qualitatively similar to what you see in laboratory experiments for the liquid at the bottom of this tank here, starting to increase over time as a result of the brine rejection out of the overlying ice. Okay, so I think I've spoken too much, so I'm going to shut up and let you read my conclusions.
We do have time for a couple of questions.
You showed some results for the frazil ice crystals, moving around in flow. Were they affecting the flow itself, or were they?
Yes. Yeah. So so I should say this is not exactly frazil ice. So first, it's a two-dimensional simulation. So these are actually long cylinders, but it's something to build some insight. But once these crystals get large enough, so in the simulation, these are basically, we're using a immersed boundary method, basically in the lattice Boltzmann method. So we're enforcing a no slip and no normal flow condition everywhere over the surface of every single one of these particles. So it's right on the edge of being reasonably resolved. So they are also then, so the crystals then feel the hydrodynamic forces and the buoyancy force on the crystal. So they're responding to the forces imparted by the flow. And then they also provide corresponding hydrodynamic forces back on the liquid. So it's fully coupled. So they are providing a feedback on the flow. And depending on what fractions you have, it can have different magnitudes and signs, etc.
Do we have any more questions?
Very nice presentation of the frazil ice equation, Roger. I wasn't quite sure if you actually solved them or not.
Yeah, so I didn't go into this because David's talking about it on Friday and I didn't.
Oh, I see. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Okay. As a spoiler, anyway.
Yeah.
You mentioned for the frazil crystal interaction term.
Yeah.
Okay. So do you actually incorporate flocculation?
So the simulations we did, we don't include flocculation because it's not extremely well constrained. But yeah.
Okay.
So it's not a, yeah. So the interaction term is something that, so the two terms I underline saying that they were poorly understood are, in my opinion, poorly understood at the moment. So we had when we do, David talks about some simulations later, there'll be a description of nucleation that I think he will talk about. And then he'll also mention this interaction term and then say that for most of the simulations it's neglected, I think.
Does the interaction term incorporate the second nucleation?
Yeah, sorry, I'm being a little bit loose here. So the interaction term, we'll account for crystals giving rise to nucleation from collisions and making new small pieces of ice. So if two crystals smash into each other, the ice can actually fracture. So with sufficient inertia, they can actually fracture, and that can generate new crystals. So that contributes to the nucleation, but the flocculation is not built in at the moment.
Okay, well, time for more questions during coffee, but let's move on with our